I was shaking a bit as I pushed through the heavy glass doors of Riverside Elementary School. First day nerves always got to me, but today felt different, worse than usual. The rain had soaked through my cardigan during the short walk from my car, and I held my messenger bag close as I headed to the main office. The hallways looked like every other elementary school. Colorful bulletin boards covered the walls with student artwork and motivational posters. Everything smelled like cleaning supplies, mixed with something I couldn't quite place. It reminded me of old buildings, though Riverside Elementary wasn't even 30 years old. I found the main office easily and walked up to the reception desk. A woman looked up from her computer. "You must be Emily Miller," she said warmly. "I'm Janet, the secretary. Margaret Green is waiting for you in her office." Margaret Green. I'd talked to her on the phone for my interview. She seemed professional enough, but I remember her asking some weirdly specific questions about how well I follow directions. Janet pointed to a door with a brass nameplate. I knocked softly and went in. Margaret looked up from a stack of papers. She had on a dark navy pantsuit that made her look even more formal than I remembered. "Miss Miller, please, have a seat." She gestured to the chair across from her desk without offering a smile. I settled into the chair, placing my bag at my feet. Margaret reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a single sheet of paper, typed, not handwritten, with clean margins and numbered points. "Before we discuss your classroom assignment or curriculum expectations, there are 5 rules you must understand." Margaret's voice carried an unusual weight, as if each word had been carefully chosen. "These are not suggestions or guidelines. They are absolute requirements." She slid the paper across the desk. I picked it up. It looked really official, not like a normal school policy paper. Riverside Elementary School. Mandatory protocols. 1. Classroom doors must remain open at all times during school hours. No exceptions. 2. If you hear scratching sounds in the hallway, do not investigate. Remain in your classroom until the sounds stop completely. 3. Never look directly at blinking lights. Keep your eyes down and continue with your planned activities. 4. Do not acknowledge or respond to children who appear in the hallways after 3:30 p.m. 5. If someone knocks on your classroom door and asks to enter, do not respond unless you can verify their identity through the main office first. I read through the list twice. I thought I must have misunderstood something. These weren't normal school safety protocols. They were bizarre. "I'm sorry, but I don't quite understand. The first rule about keeping doors open, isn't that a fire safety issue? And these other items..." I gestured at the paper, searching for the right words. Margaret's blue eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made me shift uncomfortably in my chair. "Miss Miller, you will follow every rule on that list exactly as written. Your safety and the safety of your students depends on it. But what's the reasoning behind..." "The reasoning is survival." Margaret's tone left no room for questions. "You'll keep that list with you at all times. Memorize it if you need to, but never deviate from any protocol." I folded the paper carefully and tucked it into my bag, though the whole conversation felt surreal. Margaret spent the next 20 minutes going over standard teaching procedures, class schedules, lesson plan requirements, emergency procedures that actually made sense. But my mind kept returning to those 5 strange rules. When she finally dismissed me to find my classroom, I walked through the hallways with fresh eyes. Every door stood wide open, propped with doorstops or held by magnetic catches. I'd assumed it was for ventilation or visibility, but now it seemed more deliberate. Other teachers moved through the corridors with purposeful strides, their eyes focused straight ahead. My classroom turned out to be bright and welcoming, with large windows and student desks arranged in neat clusters. I spent the morning setting up my materials and reviewing lesson plans, though Margaret's rules kept nagging at me. By lunchtime, I needed answers. The teacher's lounge buzzed with quiet conversation when I entered. Several staff members looked up and offered polite smiles, but one woman with auburn hair gestured me over to her table. "You must be the new third-grade teacher. I'm Susan Roberts, fourth grade." She had warm brown eyes and a genuinely friendly demeanor that put me at ease. "Emily Miller. Nice to meet you." I sat down with my sandwich, grateful for normal human interaction. "How was your morning? Margaret can be a bit intense during orientation." I lowered my voice. She gave me this list of rules that seem unusual. I was wondering if you could help me understand them better. Susan's expression changed a bit, becoming more serious. "Ah, the rules. Yes, we all follow those here. What specifically confused you?" "All of it, honestly. Keeping doors open, not looking at flickering lights, not responding to knocks. It doesn't make sense." Susan set down her coffee cup and leaned back in her chair. "Did Margaret mention Thomas Phillips?" "No. Should she have?" "Thomas was a teacher here about 2 years ago. Third grade, actually. He had your classroom before you. Really nice guy, great with the kids. He'd been here for almost a full school year when—" Susan paused, choosing her words carefully. "When he disappeared." My stomach tightened. "Disappeared? What do you mean?" "One afternoon, security cameras showed Thomas entering his classroom around 3:45. He closed the door behind him, something we're specifically told not to do. When I went to check on him an hour later, the room was completely empty." "Maybe he left through another exit?" Susan shook her head. "That classroom only has one door. No windows that open to the outside, no connecting doors to other rooms. The security footage never showed him leaving. We searched everywhere, supply closets, bathrooms, the basement. Nothing." I shivered, even though it was warm in the lunchroom. "What did the police say?" "They investigated, of course. But here's the strangest part. When we tried to get statements from his students, they acted like Thomas had never existed. These were kids who'd been in his class for 8 months, but they wouldn't acknowledge his name. They claimed they'd never had a teacher before me taking over the class. That's impossible. Children don't just forget their teachers." "You'd think so." Susan's voice dropped even lower. "But every single student insisted they'd been working independently all year. They couldn't remember a single lesson he'd taught, couldn't describe what he looked like. Nothing. It was like he'd been completely erased from their memories." I pushed my sandwich away, my appetite gone. "You're telling me a grown man vanished from a locked room and the children forgot he existed?" "I'm telling you that this school has some peculiar properties that demand respect. Those rules Margaret gave you? They exist for good reasons, even if we don't always understand what those reasons are." Susan stood up, packing up her lunch containers. "My advice? Don't try to make sense of everything here. Just follow the protocols exactly as written. The teachers who've lasted understand that some questions are better left unasked." I sat alone in the lunchroom after Susan left, staring at my untouched sandwich. Thomas Phillips had closed his classroom door, breaking the first rule, and simply vanished. The logical part of my mind insisted there had to be a reasonable explanation. People didn't just disappear, and children didn't forget entire school years. But Margaret's deadly serious tone stuck in my memory, along with Susan's warning about the school's weird properties. I pulled the rules from my bag and read through them again, each point now feeling more important than before. When the lunch period ended, I returned to my classroom and propped the door wide open with the provided doorstop. Whatever was happening at Riverside Elementary, whatever had taken Thomas Phillips, I wasn't going to find out the hard way. I would follow every rule exactly as written, even if I didn't understand them yet. 2 weeks had passed since Margaret Green gave me that strange list of rules, and I'd gotten used to life at Riverside Elementary. Almost normal. Almost. The daily stuff like planning lessons, teaching, and grading papers had become routine, though I still found myself always checking that my classroom door stayed propped wide open, just like every other teacher did. What started as a weird rule now felt like something I did without thinking. I'd even gotten used to how other staff members walked through the hallways. Everyone moved quickly, eyes straight ahead. No chatting by lockers or looking into empty classrooms. It seemed like they were just being professional rather than acting strange like I first thought. That Thursday afternoon, I sat at my desk grading math worksheets while fall rain hit the classroom windows. The building was quiet after dismissal, with only distant sounds of janitors working in other parts of the school. Most kids had caught their buses, and the usual after-school noise had died down to just the quiet buzz of the air system. I was halfway through marking Michael Thompson's multiplication problems when I heard it, a slow, careful scratching sound from somewhere in the hallway. My pen stopped as I turned to listen better. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound was steady, like fingernails dragging across wood, not like a small animal or furniture being moved. This was careful, like something was doing it on purpose, and it was moving slowly down the hall outside my open door. My first thought was to get up and check it out. Maybe it was a backpack zipper against a locker or maintenance work nobody told me about. I started to push back from my desk, ready to walk to my doorway and look into the hall. Then I remembered what Margaret told me. If you hear scratching sounds in the hallway, do not investigate. Stay in your classroom until the sounds stop completely. Rule number 2. I knew all 5 rules by now, though this was the first time I needed to follow one. The scratching kept going, and I really wanted to look and see what was making that sound. It felt weird not to check. Instead, I made myself stay in my seat and picked up my red pen again. I tried to focus on whether Michael had gotten 7 times 8 right. The scratching got louder, like whatever was making it had come closer to my classroom. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound gave me goosebumps. I kept my eyes on the math problems, marking answers and circling mistakes, but my whole body was tense. The scratching stopped right outside my doorway, so close I could have just looked up and seen what was causing it. I didn't look up. Minutes went by that felt much longer. The scratching started moving again, going down the hallway, getting quieter as it moved away. I kept grading papers with shaky hands, marking each problem while listening to that weird sound fade away. When it finally got quiet again, I realized I'd been holding my breath. I put down my pen and took several deep breaths, trying to make sense of what happened. The normal explanations I first thought of didn't seem right anymore. That didn't sound like any maintenance work or kid accident I could think of. The next morning, I found myself looking at my students' faces as they got into their seats for morning reading time. These kids spent all day in this building. If anyone would have heard strange, scratching sounds, it would be them. Class, I wanted to ask you about something, I said, keeping my tone casual and conversational. Yesterday afternoon, did anyone notice any unusual sounds in the hallways after school? 23 pairs of eyes looked up at me with expressions ranging from curious to confused. Nobody immediately raised their hand or showed signs of recognition. Katie Anderson tilted her head. What kind of sounds, Ms. Miller? Like scratching noises. Maybe something dragging against the walls or doors. Katie looked confused. I used the bathroom right after the final bell yesterday and I didn't hear any scratching. She looked around at her classmates. Did anybody else? Several students shook their heads. Rebecca raised her small hand. I was getting my backpack from my locker around the same time Katie was in the bathroom. The hallways were really quiet. Marcus Chen nodded in agreement. I had to come back inside because I forgot my library book. I didn't hear anything weird. I felt nervous as I thought about their answers. These children had been in the exact area where I'd heard the scratching at the exact same time, and none of them had heard anything unusual. The scratching hadn't been meant for everyone to hear. It had been specifically directed at me. I tried to think of possible explanations, but none of them made sense. Sound doesn't work that way. Either there was a scratching noise in the hallway, or there wasn't. It couldn't exist for one person, but not for others in the same place, unless something unnatural was happening at Riverside Elementary. That thought hit me hard as I looked at my students' confused faces. The rules weren't just random policies made by an overly careful administrator. They were protection against something that didn't make normal sense, something that could create sounds only certain people could hear, something that specifically targeted individuals rather than letting everyone nearby hear it. I spent the rest of the school day trying to focus on teaching while I kept thinking about what this meant. Yesterday, I'd heard something that broke the normal rules of physics, and I'd followed rule number 2 by staying in my classroom. The connection was too obvious to ignore. That evening, I sat in my apartment with Margaret Green's business card in my hand. She'd written her personal phone number on the back during my orientation, mentioning it was for urgent matters related to school safety. This felt urgent enough. Margaret answered on the second ring, her voice as crisp and professional as always. "This is Margaret." "Ms. Green, it's Emily Miller. I'm sorry to call you at home, but I needed to discuss something that happened yesterday." "Go ahead." I took a deep breath. I heard scratching sounds in the hallway while I was grading papers. I remembered rule number 2 and stayed in my classroom until they stopped. But when I asked my students about it, none of them heard anything, even though several were in the hallway at the same time. There was a long pause. When Margaret spoke again, she sounded just as serious as she had during our first meeting. "You followed the rule correctly. That's exactly what you should have done." "But my students didn't hear anything. How is that possible?" "Miss Miller, you're asking questions that don't have answers you'd find satisfying. What matters is that you recognized the situation and responded appropriately. I need to understand what's happening here. A teacher disappeared, children forget entire school years, and now I'm hearing things that don't exist for other people. This isn't normal." "No, it isn't normal." Margaret's voice remained steady and unemotional. "But it is reality at Riverside Elementary. Those rules I gave you aren't suggestions or guidelines. They're the only thing standing between you and whatever happened to Thomas Phillips." I felt my hands tighten around the phone. What exactly happened to Thomas? He questioned the necessity of following protocols. He decided his judgment was better than the established safety measures. He was wrong. The finality in Margaret's voice left no room for further discussion about Thomas's fate. She continued before I could formulate another question. "Miss Miller, I'm going to give you the same advice I wish Thomas had taken. Don't try to understand everything that happens in that building. Don't assume your normal logic applies to every situation you encounter. Follow the rules exactly as written. Trust that they exist for good reasons and focus on teaching your students. Those are the only things that matter for your survival here." "Survival," I repeated quietly. "Yes, survival. Some knowledge is dangerous and some curiosity is fatal. You've now experienced something that should reinforce the importance of absolute compliance with those protocols. Learn from it, but don't pursue it." Margaret hung up without saying goodbye. I sat in my apartment with more questions than before, sure that I was in over my head. The scratching sounds weren't just random building noises or my imagination. They were a test, or maybe a warning. I took out the rule sheet and read all 5 points again. They meant more to me now. These weren't just rules made by a careful school administrator. They were instructions for surviving something that shouldn't be real, but definitely was. Something inside Riverside Elementary had tried to get me into the hallway yesterday. Following rule number 2 had kept me safe. I could see the pattern, even if I didn't understand how it all worked. I folded the rule sheet and put it back in my bag. I promised myself I'd follow all the rules exactly. I would teach my students, grade papers, and do my job, but I'd stick to the limits Margaret had set. The scratching sounds were the first sign that something was wrong at Riverside Elementary. I didn't want to see any more. I stood at the front of my classroom Thursday morning, guiding my students through long division problems on the whiteboard. The familiar routine of teaching had become comforting over the past few weeks, something normal and predictable in a place that had already proven to be neither. Remember to check your work by multiplying your answer back through, I told the class, moving between the desk clusters to observe their progress. Katie Anderson was working steadily through her problems, while Rebecca Wilson chewed thoughtfully on her pencil eraser. Michael Thompson hunched over his worksheet, his tousled brown hair falling across his forehead as he concentrated. That's when the fluorescent lights above us began to blink. Not the brief, occasional blink that old building lights sometimes did, but an erratic, deliberate pattern that immediately caught my attention. The lights dimmed and brightened in irregular bursts across the classroom walls and student papers. Rule number 3 popped into my mind right away. Never look directly at blinking lights. Keep your eyes down and continue with your planned activities. I forced my eyes down to the lesson plan on my desk, even though every instinct told me to look up and check what was happening with the electrical system. The blinking continued, growing more intense and frequent. "Keep working on your division problems, class," I said, proud that my voice remained steady and calm. "Focus on your worksheets." I heard the rustle of papers and pencils moving across desks, which told me most students were following my instruction. But something felt wrong in the room, a tension that wasn't there before. When I finally looked up from my lesson plan, keeping my eyes away from the ceiling lights, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Michael Thompson sat completely still at his desk, staring directly at the blinking lights overhead. His small body didn't move while the uneven flashing lit up his face. But his eyes had turned completely black. Not dilated pupils or shadowed sockets, but solid, unnatural black that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. "Michael," I said quietly, taking a step toward his desk. "Look down at your worksheet, please." He didn't respond or acknowledge my voice. The other students had noticed something wrong too. Conversations stopped, pencils paused mid-calculation, and I could feel everyone's attention turn toward Michael, who was sitting completely still. Then Michael opened his mouth and spoke in a voice that didn't belong to a 10-year-old boy. "Take care of the boy." The words came out slow and careful, in a tone so deep and weird that it seemed to shake through the classroom air. His small body stayed completely still while this impossible grown-up voice came from his mouth, like something else was using him to talk. The fluorescent lights stopped flashing completely, going back to their normal steady glow. Michael blinked several times quickly, his black eyes slowly changing back to their usual brown color. He looked around the classroom clearly confused, seeing the shocked faces of his classmates and me standing frozen halfway between my desk and his. "Why is everyone looking at me?" Michael asked, his voice back to its normal boyish tone. He glanced down at his worksheet, then back up at me with genuine bewilderment. Did I do something wrong? I struggled to find words that wouldn't terrify him or the other students. "Do you remember what just happened, Michael? The lights were flickering and you..." "The lights were flickering?" He looked up at the ceiling fixtures, which now hummed peacefully overhead. "I don't remember any lights flickering. I was just working on problem number 7. Katie Anderson raised her hand tentatively. "Ms. Miller, Michael was acting really strange. His eyes looked different and his voice sounded weird." "I wasn't acting strange," Michael protested, looking genuinely hurt and confused. "I've been doing my math problems the whole time. I don't know what you're talking about." The other students exchanged glances, clearly disturbed by what they'd witnessed, but unable to articulate exactly what had been wrong about the scene. Rebecca Wilson had moved her chair slightly away from Michael's desk, while several other children kept stealing nervous looks in his direction. I spent the rest of the math lesson trying to bring the classroom back to normal, though my mind kept replaying that deep, unnatural voice speaking through Michael's small body. The message itself troubled me almost as much as the impossible delivery method. Take care of the boy. What boy? Michael himself or someone else entirely? When recess time arrived, I watched my students head out to the playground with mixed relief and worry. Michael joined his friends for kickball as if nothing had happened, laughing and running with his usual energy. Whatever force had used his voice to deliver that message had left no sign of itself in his behavior or memory. I found Margaret Green in her office, reviewing attendance reports. She looked up when I knocked on her open door, and something in my expression must have shown how urgent my visit was. "Come in and close the door," she said, setting aside her paperwork. I sat down in my usual chair across from her desk and took a moment to think. During math class this morning, the lights in my classroom started blinking. I followed rule number 3 and kept my eyes down, but one of my students looked directly at them. Margaret's expression grew more serious. "Which student?" "Michael Thompson." His eyes turned completely black, and he spoke in a voice that didn't sound like his own. "He told me to take care of the boy." Then everything returned to normal. Michael has no memory of what happened. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled as she processed this information. "The lights chose him to deliver a message. That's significant." "Chose him? You mean this is something that happens regularly?" "Not regularly, but it's not unprecedented. The building sometimes needs to communicate information that's crucial for safety. When normal methods aren't sufficient, it finds other ways to convey warnings." I felt that familiar chill I'd experienced during our previous conversations about the school's unnatural properties. "So something in this building can take control of my students?" "Not control, exactly. Think of it more like a brief borrowing. The student isn't harmed and they retain no memory of the experience. But the message they deliver is always important." Margaret stood and walked to her window, looking out at the playground where my students were engaged in their normal recess activities. "You said the message was about taking care of the boy. That's a warning you should take seriously." "Which boy? Michael himself or someone else?" "That remains to be seen. But when the building goes to the trouble of using a student as a messenger, it means something dangerous is approaching. Pay attention to any unusual children you might encounter, particularly those who don't belong here." I thought about rule number 4, which specifically mentioned not acknowledging children who appeared in hallways after 3:30 p.m. Are we talking about students who shouldn't be in the building? Among other possibilities. Margaret returned to her desk, but remained standing. "The important thing is that you receive the warning and you'll be prepared. Most teachers who ignore these messages don't get second chances. Like Thomas Phillips?" Margaret's expression darkened slightly. "Thomas received multiple warnings through various means. He dismissed them all as coincidence or imagination. He was wrong to do so." I left Margaret's office feeling worried about what I'd just learned. My classroom was somehow being used for supernatural messages. The fluorescent lights weren't just old fixtures with electrical problems. They were connected to something bigger that could use them to send important information. Back in my classroom, I looked up at those same lights differently now. They buzzed quietly overhead, showing no sign of what had happened that morning. But I now knew they were watching, waiting, ready to pick someone else to deliver messages if needed. The rules weren't just random restrictions from a careful administrator. They were protection against something that wanted to communicate through the school itself. Something that could use my students to deliver warnings I needed to take seriously. "Take care of the boy." The message echoed in my memory as I prepared for my students' return from recess. Whatever danger was approaching, whatever situation required that warning, I would be ready for it. The building had spoken, and I had listened. Michael's strange episode with the blinking lights changed how I looked at everything in my classroom. Before that morning, I'd focused on teaching curriculum and managing typical student behaviors. Now, I found myself studying my students with the intensity of someone watching for signs of danger, because that's exactly what I was doing. The change started small. During reading time the day after the light incident, I noticed Rebecca Wilson getting up from her seat to sharpen her pencil for the 3rd time in an hour. Previously, I might have reminded her about staying focused or limiting trips around the classroom. Instead, I watched her movements more carefully. Rebecca wasn't procrastinating or seeking attention. She was restless in a way that seemed purposeful, like someone trying to avoid sitting still in a particular spot. When she approached my desk with a legitimate question about her worksheet, I studied her face and noticed the tight expression around her eyes, the look of someone concentrating on something beyond schoolwork. "Ms. Miller, can I switch seats with Marcus today?" she asked quietly. "My chair feels wrong." Her chair felt wrong. A week ago, I would have dismissed this as a child's whim and sent her back to her assigned spot. Now, remembering Margaret's warnings about trusting student feelings, I nodded and let her move to Marcus's desk across the room. Rebecca looked so relieved, I knew I'd made the right choice. 2 days later, Rebecca raised her hand during social studies. "Ms. Miller, may I wait until tomorrow to use the bathroom?" It was nearly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and we still had over an hour of school left. Asking a 7-year-old to wait that long seemed unreasonable, but something in Rebecca's tone stopped me from giving permission right away. "Are you feeling okay? Do you need to see the nurse?" "I'm fine, I don't want to go right now. It doesn't feel safe." The bathroom down the hall didn't feel safe. I looked at Rebecca's serious expression and remembered Margaret's advice about trusting what students sensed but adults couldn't perceive. "Okay, you can wait until tomorrow if you're comfortable doing that." Rebecca smiled with obvious relief and returned to her social studies worksheet. I made a mental note to watch for patterns in her bathroom avoidance. Maybe certain times of day or specific days of the week triggered her reluctance. The following week brought another change in student behavior that caught my attention. Rain had been falling steadily since morning, which meant indoor recess instead of playground time. Usually, my students scattered throughout the classroom during these periods, some reading in the corner, others playing quiet games at their desks, a few working on art projects at the supply table. But that Tuesday, they clustered together in the center of the room. Katie Anderson and 3 classmates shared picture books while sitting practically on top of each other. Michael Thompson and his friends huddled around a single desk playing a card game that normally would have accommodated twice their number. Even Rebecca had moved her reading chair closer to the main group instead of sitting by the windows as she usually preferred. I started to redirect them toward more spread-out activities, then stopped myself. Their behavior wasn't disruptive or preventing learning. They were choosing proximity over personal space. And given everything I'd learned about trusting student instincts, maybe they had good reasons. "Is everything okay, class? You all seem to want to stay close together today." Katie looked up from her picture book. "Indoor recess feels different when it's raining really hard. We like being near each other." Indoor recess felt different. Katie's explanation wasn't very clear, but she seemed to mean it. I let the kids stay in their little group and watched them for the rest of recess. None of the children looked worried or upset. They just seemed to want to stick together when rain kept them inside. The biggest thing happened the next Thursday afternoon. I was at my desk around 4 o'clock grading spelling tests and planning to stay until 5:30 to finish the week's work. Most teachers had already left, and the school was nice and quiet after dismissal. I just grabbed my red pen when Katie Anderson showed up in my doorway. She'd clearly come back from the bus area, with her backpack still on and her jacket wet from the light rain outside. "Ms. Miller, you shouldn't stay here by yourself today." I looked up from the stack of papers, surprised to see her. "Katie, what are you doing back inside? Didn't you catch your bus?" "I did, but I got off at the first stop and walked back. You need to leave now." Her tone carried an urgency that immediately put me on alert. Katie was typically cheerful and easygoing, but she stood in my doorway with the serious expression of someone delivering crucial information. "Why do I need to leave? Is something wrong?" "Bad things happen when teachers stay alone after everyone goes home. My mom can drive you to your car if you don't want to walk by yourself." Bad things happen when teachers stay alone. I thought about Thomas Phillips, who had stayed in his classroom after hours and disappeared without a trace. I thought about Margaret's warnings about trusting student perceptions of danger. I thought about the scratching sounds that had targeted me specifically when I was working alone. Katie, how do you know something bad might happen? She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, clearly struggling to explain something she understood instinctively but couldn't articulate in adult terms. The building feels hungry when it's empty. Teachers who stay by themselves sometimes don't come back the next day. The building feels hungry. Katie's words sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the October weather outside. She was describing something she'd seen or felt, giving me a warning with the same casual tone she might use to say it was raining. I started packing up my papers immediately. You're absolutely right. I'll finish grading these at home tonight. Katie's relieved smile told me I'd made the right decision. She waited while I got my stuff, turned off the classroom lights, and locked my door. We walked to the main entrance together, where her mother waited in a running car. Mrs. Anderson, thank you for letting Katie come back to get me. Katie's mother, a woman in her 30s with the same blonde hair and bright eyes as her daughter, leaned across the passenger seat to speak through the lowered window. Katie insisted we turn around when she saw you were still inside. She said teachers shouldn't be alone in the building after dark. I've learned to trust her instincts about these things. I got into my car feeling weird that a 7-year-old had just saved me from whatever danger was in Riverside Elementary after hours. Katie had risked missing her bus and made her mother drive back to school because she thought I was in danger. The next morning, I looked for Susan Roberts before classes started. I found her in the copy room preparing worksheets for the day. Susan, can I ask you something about last night? Did anything unusual happen after I left around 4:15? Susan looked up from the copy machine with a puzzled expression. Last night? Actually, yes. I got a call from the security company around 6 o'clock. The motion sensors were going off throughout the building. Hallways, empty classrooms, even the basement. But when they checked the video feeds, all the cameras showed empty spaces. Motion sensors triggering throughout empty hallways, while security cameras recorded nothing. I thought about what that meant. Something had been moving through the school last night. Something that could trigger physical sensors, but didn't appear on video surveillance. Did they find any explanation for the sensor activity? None. The security team did a full walkthrough and found all doors locked. No signs of intrusion, no equipment malfunctions. They filed it as an unexplained electrical issue, but... Susan paused, studying my expression with the wariness I'd come to associate with discussions of the school's stranger aspects. But you don't think it was electrical, I finished. I think something roams these hallways after the building empties, and I think teachers who stay late encounter it. Thomas Phillips was working alone when he disappeared. Thomas Phillips. Always back to Thomas Phillips and his breaking of the rules, but this time I got the connection completely. Thomas had stayed in the building after hours, and whatever was moving through those empty hallways had found him. Katie Anderson had sensed that same danger coming yesterday and had literally come back to warn me. Her gut feeling had kept me from running into whatever set off those motion sensors while staying hidden from security cameras. I went to see Margaret Green in her office during my lunch break. I wanted to know more about why my students seemed so protective. The children at this school seem to know things, I said without preamble. They sense dangers that adults miss. Yesterday, one of my students warned me not to stay late, and last night the motion sensors went off throughout the building. Margaret nodded as if she'd been expecting this conversation. The children are closer to the truth than adults are. We lose that sensitivity as we grow older and rely more on logic and less on instinct. So I should trust what they tell me about safety? Always. The students at Riverside Elementary have generations of inherited knowledge about navigating this place safely. They pass warnings down through playground conversations and shared experiences. What they know could keep you alive. Generations of inherited knowledge. I thought about Katie's matter-of-fact explanation that bad things happen to teachers who stayed alone, delivered with the confidence of someone repeating established wisdom. Margaret, what exactly roams the building after hours? Something that feeds on isolation and vulnerability, It seeks out individuals who separate themselves from the collective safety that comes with groups and daylight hours. Thomas Phillips made himself a target by staying alone. I left Margaret's office with a new understanding of my role at Riverside Elementary. Teaching reading and math was just part of my responsibilities. The more crucial job involved protecting my students while learning to trust their guidance through dangers I couldn't fully perceive. Rebecca's bathroom avoidance, the students clustering together during rainy indoor recess, Katie's urgent warning about staying late, these weren't random childhood behaviors. They were survival strategies developed by children who lived daily with threats that adults either couldn't sense or chose to rationalize away. My students weren't just learning from me. They were teaching me how to survive in a place where normal rules didn't apply, where supernatural dangers required supernatural awareness. The building might use them as messengers when necessary, but more often they served as early warning systems for threats that could destroy unwary adults. I would continue teaching curriculum and grading papers and conducting normal classroom activities. But I would also listen when Rebecca said her chair felt wrong, allow my students to cluster together when their instincts demanded it, and never ignore a warning about staying too late. The children could navigate this place in ways that adults had forgotten. My job was to protect them, while letting them guide me through the supernatural landscape of Riverside Elementary School. Friday afternoon arrived with the kind of exhausted relief that only comes at the end of a difficult week. I sat at my desk reviewing reading comprehension worksheets while my students worked quietly on their independent reading assignments. The soft rustle of turning pages and occasional whispered questions created the peaceful atmosphere I'd grown to appreciate during these final hours before weekend freedom. 3 weeks had passed since Michael's episode with the blinking lights, and I'd developed a rhythm of watching for signs while maintaining normal classroom routines. Rebecca had avoided the bathroom during specific afternoon hours all week, though she couldn't explain why. Katie had positioned herself near the center of the room each day, close enough to other students to maintain what she called group safety. These behaviors no longer seemed strange to me. They were protective measures I'd learned to respect and accommodate. The knock on my classroom door came at exactly 2:45. 3 sharp raps, deliberate and formal, unlike the casual tapping of students or the quick knocks of fellow teachers. My hand paused mid-sentence on the worksheet I was grading as I looked up toward the doorway. A boy stood in the hallway just outside my open door. He appeared to be about 12 years old, with neatly combed dark hair and clothes that looked oddly formal for a typical student. His white button-up shirt was tucked precisely into dark slacks, and his shoes were polished to a shine. Everything about his appearance suggested careful attention to presentation, but something felt fundamentally wrong about the entire picture. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said in a voice that carried too much formality for his apparent age. "May I come inside your classroom?" I didn't recognize him as one of our students. In a school as small as Riverside Elementary, I knew most children by sight even if they weren't in my class. This boy's face was completely unfamiliar, yet he stood in our hallway as if he belonged there. His skin caught my attention next, pale in a way that seemed unnatural, almost see-through under the fluorescent lights. The pallor wasn't the healthy fairness of a child who spent time indoors, but something deeper and more troubling. His eyes, dark and serious, looked at me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. Rule number 5 came to my memory. Do not respond to knocks on your classroom door without first checking identity through the main office. I remained seated at my desk, continuing to grade papers as if I hadn't heard his request. My students had noticed the boy's presence. Several looked up from their books to watch the interaction, but they kept their reading positions without comment. The boy knocked again, louder this time. 3 more deliberate raps against the doorframe. "Ma'am, I'm lost and I need help finding my classroom. Could you please let me come inside so we can talk?" His voice sounded weird for someone who looked so young. He talked too perfectly, too clearly. like he was pretending to be a polite kid instead of actually being one. I kept looking at the worksheet in front of me, focusing hard on marking answers. "Please continue reading quietly, class," I said to my students, proud that my voice remained steady and calm. "We'll finish our discussion of Chapter 3 in just a few minutes." Katie Anderson looked up from her book with a worried face, but she followed my instruction and went back to reading. Rebecca Wilson had moved her chair slightly away from the door area, sitting further back in the classroom. Even Michael Thompson seemed more focused than usual, actually paying attention to his book. The knocking became more insistent. The boy hit the door frame harder, creating sharp sounds that carried through the hallway and into my classroom. "I really need help, ma'am. I don't know where I'm supposed to be. And I'm going to get in trouble if I'm late for class. Please just look at me and tell me where to go." Something in his tone had changed from polite formality to barely controlled frustration. The careful pronunciation was still there, but I could hear the impatience underneath it. All my teacher instincts from Riverside Elementary were telling me something was wrong. I turned a page of the worksheet stack, pretending I was just doing normal grading. My hand shook a little as I grabbed my red pen, but I kept marking wrong answers and writing comments in margins. Focusing on this routine helped me stay calm while that strange boy kept making requests outside my door. "Ma'am, I can see you sitting right there at your desk. I know you can hear me talking to you. Why won't you help a student who needs assistance?" The formal politeness was disappearing entirely now, replaced by something that sounded almost accusatory. His voice had a harshness to it. 20 minutes passed with the boy, alternating between renewed knocking and increasingly demanding requests for entry. My students kept reading with impressive focus, though I could sense their growing tension as his voice became more insistent. "I'm going to tell the principal that you refused to help a lost student," he announced with obvious anger. "Teachers are supposed to help children, not ignore them when they ask for assistance. You're going to get in serious trouble for this." The threat scared me more than his previous requests had. He talked like someone who knew all about the school pecking order and exactly what would freak out a new teacher. But I kept thinking about what Margaret told me about following the rules exactly, which felt more important than his threats. So I kept working on my paperwork. "Open this door right now," he demanded, abandoning all pretense of being a lost child seeking help. "I know you can hear me, and I know you're deliberately ignoring me. Let me inside your classroom immediately." His voice dropped to a tone no child could have, deep and scary. Whatever was outside my door wasn't a 12-year-old student, no matter what it looked like. The knocking stopped abruptly. The hallway outside my classroom went completely quiet, which felt weird after 20 minutes of constant knocking. I waited a few more minutes before I looked up from the papers on my desk. The doorway was empty. No boy in formal clothes, no pale kid with serious eyes, nobody there at all. The hallway was quiet in both directions, just like it should be during class time. "Is he gone, Ms. Miller?" Katie asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, he's gone. You can continue reading normally now." My students relaxed visibly, going back to their books looking relieved that they'd dodged a bullet. They knew something was wrong, even if they didn't know what it was, and they stayed quiet while I handled things. I went to Margaret Green's office right after school ended, while I could still remember everything about meeting that weird kid. "I need to tell you about something that happened during final period today," I began, settling into the chair across from her desk. "A boy I didn't recognize came to my classroom door asking to come inside. He looked about 12, with old-fashioned clothes and very pale skin." Margaret's expression grew serious immediately. "You followed rule number 5? "Yes. I didn't respond to him at all, even when he became angry and threatened to report me to the principal. He kept knocking and demanding entry for about 20 minutes, then disappeared completely." "Good. You handled that exactly as you should have." Margaret leaned back in her chair with the satisfied expression of someone whose expectations had been met. "That particular visitor has been appearing at Riverside Elementary for decades. Decades. The word hit me with uncomfortable implications about the true age and nature of whatever had stood outside my classroom. He targets new teachers specifically, Margaret continued. Always appears as a lost child needing help. Always requests entry to the classroom. His story changes slightly over the years, but the basic approach remains consistent. What happens to teachers who respond to him? Margaret looked worried. They're found in their empty classrooms the next morning, just like Thomas Phillips, sitting at their desks as if they're grading papers or preparing lessons, but completely unresponsive to anything around them. I thought about the boy's increasingly angry demands and threats, his voice dropping to impossible tones as his polite act fell apart. So, he becomes more aggressive when teachers don't open the door? Much more aggressive. He'll threaten, cajole, even claim to be injured or in danger, anything to convince a teacher to break protocol. But teachers who maintain the boundary and refuse all interaction remain safe. And those who don't are found in their classrooms in a state that's technically alive but completely vacant. They breathe, their hearts beat, but nothing of their actual consciousness remains. The bodies are transferred to specialized care facilities, but they never recover any awareness or recognition. Margaret stood and walked to her window, looking out at the parking lot where buses were departing with their loads of students heading home for the weekend. The boy represents something that feeds on broken boundaries. He needs permission to enter a space, needs a teacher to willingly engage with him. The rules aren't arbitrary restrictions. They're the only barrier between normal life and something that consumes whatever makes us essentially human. I understood now why Margaret had emphasized memorizing every protocol exactly as written. The rules weren't guidelines for managing typical school situations. They were survival instructions for navigating supernatural predators that wore familiar forms. How long has this been happening? Since the school was built in 1962, every few years a new teacher encounters him. Most learn to follow the rules after their first experience. Some don't survive long enough to apply the lesson. Margaret returned to her desk and pulled out a thick file folder I'd never seen before. These are incident reports spanning 6 decades. Teachers who opened doors, investigated scratching sounds, looked directly at blinking lights, acknowledged children in hallways after hours, or violated the open door policy. The outcomes are remarkably consistent. She didn't offer to show me the contents of the folder, and I didn't ask to see them. The message was clear enough. Those who followed the rules survived, while those who didn't became warning stories filed away in Margaret's office. The building itself isn't malevolent, Margaret explained, but it attracts things that are. The rules exist because previous generations of teachers learned through tragic experience what behaviors were safe and which ones invited disaster. I walked to my car that evening with a new view of my job at Riverside Elementary. Teaching reading and math wasn't my only job. I also had to keep up boundaries against supernatural threats that were always looking for ways to get in. The boy was a test, not about my teaching or how I handled my classroom, but about whether I'd choose safety over helping someone who seemed to need it. Not opening that door saved my life and kept my students from seeing whatever would have happened if I had. The rules weren't suggestions. They were the only thing keeping normal daily life separate from something dangerous. Teachers who stayed alive at Riverside learned to stick to these rules more than their gut feelings, more than what society expects about helping kids, more than worrying about getting in trouble for saying no. I would keep teaching here, doing normal lessons and following standards. But I'd follow every rule exactly, knowing my life depended on not mistaking what looks like a normal school situation for actual safety. The boy would come back someday, either going after another new teacher or trying me again. When he did, I would sit at my desk, grade papers, and act like I couldn't hear his knocks, because now I knew the rules weren't just protection. They were all that stood between teaching children and becoming another file in Margaret Green's folder.